Luckily, it says here that I'm the informal chair. This is going to be very informal. I'm going to take that very seriously and very literally. I'm very, very pleased here to sort of be on the sidelines of a wonderful session. And we will begin by welcoming Professor Yitzhak Chen to this session. And he is the director of this institute, which has been so generous and welcoming. Professor Chen, who is a historian, is, from our point of view here, a friend of classical texts and of classicists and of the classics department. And we welcome him very warmly to open this session in English. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana, and welcome all to the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. I won't repeat whatever I said already in my first introduction in Hebrew. You all know that this is the most important institute for advanced studies around the world, and definitely in Israel. Well, the only one in Israel, but still extremely important. And indeed, I am a friend of classicists and the classics department. I'm a graduate of that department, and I will show you some of my experience with classical philology today. Briefly introductory words. So in my welcoming words to the Hebrew session this morning, I was referring to the comforting role of the classics in time of personal crisis, which in the case of Jerome was also a source for further anxiety. Now I should like to move to a territory I feel more comfortable in, and that's the post-Roman barbarian world, which was extremely classical as well. And to the comforting role of the classics in times of political crisis. And no one is better to demonstrate that than my dear old friend, the Bishop Gregory of Tours. In the introduction to his opus magnum, the 10 books of history, he writes that, and I'll give you the Latin and I read to you the translation. The practice of literacy, literary composition, is failing, indeed dying in the cities of Gaul. Many things were being done, both well and evilly. The savagery of heathens raged. The anger of kings was sharpened. Churches were assailed by heretics, but protected by Catholics. Among very many people, the Christian faith burned hot, but for some, it was lukewarm. The churches themselves were enriched by the devout or stripped by the wicked, but no grammarian skilled in the art of dialectic could be found to describe this situation in prose or metrical poetry. Many used very often to groan and say, "These are times of woe. The study of letters die among us, nor can any rhetorician be found in our people to publish these present deeds in his pages." Indeed, a crisis, political crisis. The barbarians are invading the West, settling, destroying Roman bureaucracy and founding their own kingdoms. Now, these crises, which undoubtedly affected the literary culture and learning of the early medieval West, is also a jumping board for the preservation of classics and the reading of classics in time of crisis. And in order to get a sense of what people did read, like Gregory of Tours, for example, we should go to his second introduction to his Glory of the Martyrs. And then there he wrote, the priest Jerome, which we have mentioned already today, an important teacher of the church, second only to the Apostle Paul, relates that he was once led before the tribunal of the eternal judge. Although stretched out in supplication, he was strongly criticized because he had too often read the subtleties of Cicero and the lies of Virgil. And in the presence of the holy angels, he confessed to the Lord of all that he would never again read these books and that he would think only about whatever was judged worthy of God and advantageous to the edification of the church. So he does remember Jerome, and Jerome flirted with classical literature. But then he goes on. And since I desire to publish some of the miracles of saints that have until now been hidden, I do not wish myself to be overcome by or entangled in these snares, that is Cicero and Virgil. I do not commemorate the flight of Saturn, the wrath of Juno, the debaucheries of Jupiter, the insult of Neptune, the scepter of Iolus, or the wars, shipwreck, and kingdoms of IIAS. I say nothing about the mission of Cupid, the love of Ascanius, and the wedding, tears, and fearsome destruction of Dido, the gloomy entrance court of Pluto, the debauched rape of Persephone, or the triple heads of Cerberus. Nor will I repeat the conversation of Anchises, the trickeries of the man from Ithaca, that is Odysseus, the cunning of Achilles, or the description of Sinon. I will not recount the advice of Laocoon, the strength of Amphitryon's son, that is Hercules, nor or the contest, exile, and fatal death of Janus. I will not describe the shapes of the Eumenides or of different monsters, nor the contrivances of the other myths that this author, Virgil, has either deceitfully fabricated or depicted in heroic verse. Well, he was well versed with Virgil and the Latin classics. Now, in time of crisis, Gregory did read the classics. Not only did he read the classics, he also trained himself in classical rhetoric and classical writing. And in order to give you just a quick example of the talent of Gregory in writing in a classical prose, let's go back to his introduction to his Libri Historiarum. To begin with the overall structure, the sentence's careful organization is immediately apparent. It comprises a single period, which, despite its length, never escaped its author control. The main clause occurs more than 2/3 of the way through the whole, and it is followed by a subordinate particle, gentes, introducing the vivid direct speech, which closes the sentence. And that's a trick which Gregory is very fond of. Before the main verb, Gregory deploys several subordinate clauses, an initial long ablative absolute, and a complex series of cum clauses, which are bound together by a varied selection of conjunctions, as well as by a sedenton, and also an aphra. The majority of the cum clauses are short and well-balanced, but the last one trails a subordinate number of its own, a subordinate member of its own, the relative purpose clause, qui, and so on and so forth. To these, one can add the vividness in Gregory's choice of verbs and other metaphorical expression, the striking alliteration with which the sentence ends, the occasional antithesis and chiasmus, as well as his liberal use of hyperbaton. Thus, while Gregory may well lament the lack of grammatici and rhetorics skilled in prose writing, in so doing, he displays a considerable mastery of their supposedly lost art, and all these in time of crisis. So I wish you all a pleasant afternoon and welcome to the Institute.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen, Itzik, and it almost makes a crisis seem like a fun, fun place to be, especially if your thing is, you know, syntax. Anyway, I enjoyed it very much. Now I want to introduce Professor Andrea Rothstein, who is going to talk to us semi-briefly about reading classics in times of crisis. Andrea is a chairperson who has ushered in a vibrant time in our classics department and is now also guiding us very sensitively and in a wonderful way through this horribly challenging time. And I'm extremely grateful to you for that, and also for setting up the together with everybody else who was involved. Please come and speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Itzik. Thank you to the Institute for hosting us in this workshop. There is no handout and no PowerPoint presentation. It's just me and my written text. When I was young, I used to read emotionally tuned, diving into the stories, being so involved that the outer world almost disappeared. Later on, when I went to college in Argentina, I found in grammar and syntax a form of emotional detachment that was good at the time. With time, I became a classical philologist, a professional reader of ancient Greek and Latin texts. For the last 20 years or so, my job has been to ask research questions and seek for answers that may be substantiated by ancient evidence. The days and weeks after October 7th brought me back to the emotional kind of reading. Well-known Greek and Latin texts just offered trigger after trigger. Still, I made an effort to prepare for the semester. I tried to read the first chapters of Herodotus to see what language issues my advanced Greek class would discuss with Yakir. There I found, as causes of the war between Persians and Greeks, a parade of kidnapped young women, Io, Europa, Medea, Helena. I moved on to the Homeric hymn to Demeter, a text my students would be reading and have read with Dana. At the very beginning, Persephone is having a good time with her friends, picking flowers at a beautiful meadow, when Hades seized her, I quote, against her will, put her on his golden chariot and drove away as she wept. She cried with a piercing voice, calling upon her father, the son of Kronos, the highest and the best, but no one of the immortal ones or of human mortals heard her voice, end of quote. I moved on to prepare my own classes on Livius, and there, at the very beginning of Roman history, the abduction of the young Sabine women. Everywhere I looked, there were women kidnapped or raped, fallen cities, death. This workshop was born in the weeks after October 7th. To many of us in this corner of the world, the events that unfolded shattered the sense or the illusion that we are safe, that we are in control, that life is relatively predictable. The illusion probably shared with many Western intellectuals that as long as we zoom in to a small enough portion of space and time, we can see ourselves as morally fair. Many people have asked, how do we move on from here? Some of us move on by going back to our classics. For comfort, true, consolation, after all, was a respectable literary genre for ancient Stoics. for escapism. Even Livius wished he could be able to close his eyes to the evils that his generation had witnessed for so many years. For political guidance, maybe, provided human nature stays the same, though I dread to think what the cycle may bring after democracy. But perhaps Greek tragedy encapsulates best the sorrow, the uncertainties, the impossible yet unavoidable choices that often lead to different forms of doom, and occasionally to appeasement and almost redemption. This morning I spoke about Greek texts, so in this session I would like to offer two brief reflections about a Latin one, Virgil's Aeneid, focusing on a tragic moment and an anti-tragic one. The second book of Virgil's Aeneid used to be my favorite. Now, I don't really know anymore. It describes the last day of Troy from the point of view of the conquered, from the eyes of IIAS. The narrative is masterfully constructed, the epic hexameter often turning lyrical. A famous scene involves a priest and a monster, a liar and a naive audience. The Greeks have left the Trojan shores, leaving behind a huge wooden horse. The narrator knows, in hindsight, that Greek warriors hide inside the horse. A Greek deserter tells of a prophecy. Should the Trojans themselves bring the horse into town, the town will be safe. It would be total victory. A priest, Laocoon, senses the deception. He warns the Trojans, Timeo Danaos, et dona ferentes. I fear the Greeks, even if they bring gifts. Poseidon then sends two horrific serpents that crush the priest and his children to death. The Trojans take this as a portent, showing that Laocoon was wrong. With their own hands, they breach the walls of Troy and take in the war machine. Laocoon, however, was right. The serpents came to make him shut up. If anything, the portent gave confirmation to a lie. What a tragedy when even the gods conspire to make us blind to what is in plain sight, deaf to voices of warning or dissent. Virgil's Aeneid can and has been read as Augustan propaganda, as a justification of Roman imperialism. However, many have detected another voice underneath the assertion of national self-assurance, an ambivalence that to me feels very familiar these days. After all, the Aeneid depicts the struggles of various nations, Trojans, Phoenicians, Latins, Acadians, many of them immigrants, a struggle to find a home. There is fear, anger, vengeance, death, but there are also alliances, friendship, and sometimes even hope. Most people remember the fatal affair of Dido with Aeneas, but I cherish the appearances of Dido in book 1 before Cupid drives her mad. She is majestic. When the first Trojans arrive to Carthage, Dido suggests, "Do you wish to settle here with me as equals in my kingdom? The city I am building is yours. Draw up your ships. Trojans and Tyrians will be treated by me without distinction." Later, when Aeneas arrives, Dido invites the Trojans to enter her palace. A similar fortune, she says, driving me through many troubles, willed that I would at last dwell on this land. Not ignorant of evil, I've learned to aid the unfortunate. The encounter of Dido and Aeneas is a prefiguration of the major confrontation between Rome and Carthage. However, before the gods interfered, Virgil gives us a Dido that sees the Trojans as fellow refugees, themselves facing adversity. For a moment, in a scene of sheer humanity, Virgil insinuates the question, what if? What if Aeneas had stayed? Imagine that. A totally anti-tragic ending. Troy and Carthage united in a Rome that would never get that name. Literature can be subversive. I come from Argentina. I should know about it. Literature opens our eyes to multiple perspectives. It can lead us to empathize even with the enemy. Literature allows to imagine the unimaginable, to love Rome while crying for Carthage. 2 months ago, in mid-January, I met with one of our graduates who is now studying abroad. She told me that after October 7th, for a week, she was unable to get out of bed. Always an avid reader, she tried to find comfort in literature, but even Primo Levi wouldn't help. Then she tried a genre of ancient literature that had never appealed to her before, Greek tragedy. Reading the Oresteia did help. We talked a couple of days ago. I asked her, what was it about the Oresteia that you find helpful? The distance, she said. The distance and seeing that sometimes there is an ending to all of it. Like 5th century BC Athens, when audiences largely made of war veterans watched plays composed and partly performed by war veterans, this may be for us a time for literature, a time for classics, to observe, to discuss at safe distance what is beautiful, what is awful about human nature. In times of crisis, a workshop like this may feel like a luxury. Literature, and particularly the ancient texts of Greece and Rome, may feel like a luxury, more suitable for times of peace and prosperity. I think the opposite is true. The study of literature, the study of the ancient world, is a necessity precisely in times of crisis. It is for times like this that we are here, and we are here. 3 departments of classical studies at Israeli universities, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Bar-Ilan, and classical scholars at Ben Gurion, Haifa University, the Open University, Seminar HaKibbutzim, Shenkar, and other institutions of higher education. The 3 small departments of classical studies have together recruited 6 scholars in the last 5 years. Closing or merging has been so far the path not taken. Since then, the number of students at the Hebrew University have doubled. I hear there are more students in Tel Aviv and Bar-Ilan too. I wouldn't be surprised if we witness a renaissance precisely because of the war. But it's not for the numbers or even the international prestige that we do have, that Israeli universities maintain their classics departments. Officials may not know it, but the logic for keeping classics alive is that of the nature reserve. Countries don't expect nature reserves to generate their own budget. In Israel, at any rate, only 1/3 of the budget comes from paying visitors. Nature reserves provide healthy forms of recreation. They protect open spaces and the variety of natural species to preserve them for future generations. The same with classical studies and the study of ancient cultures in general. We preserve, deepen, and expand the knowledge of the past so our communities and future generations too can profit from the variety of past human experience. We are gatekeepers of the past, and this is also our time. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for your really heartfelt and relevant words, very wise as well. Thank you, really. And I think we have now to bring Dima on. We have to summon him up from the.
I am summoned.
You know, and then you have to pour any.
You should have began with all the times you have summoned me in the past before summoned me now, but it will be, yeah.
Okay, Dima Ezrochi is a doctoral student and has many prestigious fellowships, which were mentioned by Ulrich this morning. And he is now writing a doctorate on, he just finished his MA and the physical aspects of the digestive tract through the how they're represented in Aristotle, in the context of how other scientific and philosophical writers describe these things, and I hope also with focus on how they're represented, and the doctorate is also on similar themes, but broader. Now, Dima has been called here to give us a small resume of the morning session, which was in Hebrew, therefore not accessible to everyone who's here.
Yes. Okay, so thank you very much. It will be a short resume just to encourage everyone to learn Hebrew and to attend similar sessions. Okay, so the morning session began with a short reading from Professor Yitzhak Chen, who presented us with a primary example of classics in times of crisis. He showed how reading classics is not only Jerome's response to an occurring crisis, his exile from Rome, but also the catalyst of a further crisis. As we have already read today, God judges Jerome as a Ciceronian rather than a Christian, thus risking his chances of inheriting eternal life. Professor Andrea Rothstein set the theme for our session by presenting, contrasting, and problematizing the distinction between cold-hearted and professional engagement with the ancient texts, especially Greek tragedy, and a personal, emotional, therapeutic reading of these same texts. Later, Mr. Gideon Manelis, an MA student in the classics department at the Hebrew University, talked about Cicero's speech to Pompey in Lucan's Civil War. He highlighted the irony of Cicero being presented as a populist, almost a religious or philosophical fanatic, coercing Pompey's hand to a battle whose fate is doomed. Gideon raised important questions about the temptation to populism and zealotry when one is weary and tired from the grinding realities of a protracted state of emergency and war. Later, I discussed Galen's On Avoiding Distress, Peria Lupia, presenting the tension between personal tragedies and national or global catastrophes. Galen, I argued, does not solve the tension between dealing with one's personal grief and the recognition that it pales in comparison to more global disasters. Rather, he amplifies it, and this amplification is fruitful for our dealing with current events. Second session, Mr. Oad Katz, also an MA student at the Hebrew University, presented us with a reading of Aristophanes' Achernians, interpreted as a plea to imagine peace as a reality against all odds. He emphasized that the mere act of imagining peace is already a radically political and nonetheless necessary act. Finally, Professor Yoav Rinon called for a revolution in the traditional, or dare I say traditionalist, appreciation of Achilles as a romantic figure compared to Odysseus' smallness. He argued that Odysseus, though small, even pathetically small and limited, is human and thus, perhaps, also humane, at least to some extent, while Achilles' menace is a source for doom for the Greeks then and maybe for us now. If there was a common theme running through all these talks, we might label it as a plea for a minor rather than a major approach to suffering, one in which defeat, grief, and limits are recognized, while the temptation for an all-consuming rage without end or a viable goal in mind is rejected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dima. Thank you very much for a very compact and thorough at the same time resume of the morning sessions. I'm now inviting Professor Deborah Gera, who is my personal teacher who got me to think about dialogue in a seminar that you gave once, but is a member of Emerita from our department who has written widely. She's written about, she's edited Judith. She's written a monograph about Xenophon's Chiropaideia and about language as conceived by Greeks, and also about women, the stories of women, yeah. And now happens to be writing now for a while a work about scenes of grief and sorrow in literature and art, and she is going to speak about some of this. Please come and speak. Everybody has the handout who wants one. Okay. Please do come. Thank you. And if there's time after her talk, there can be a question or two.
Thank you, Dana, and I'd like to thank Andrea and the other organizers and the Institute for organizing this workshop. I was very pleased to have the invitation because, among other things, it made me think about trying to comprehend life through text versus trying to comprehend text through life. In my talk, I'll be discussing one of the most beautiful and moving passages in Homer, possibly in Greek literature. And I want to begin with an apology. I may well be detracting from Homer rather than adding anything to his wonderful book 24. I feel a little bit like this mosaic that you see on the first page of the handout. This is from 250 or to 300 CE. It's found in the Biblical Lands Museum. It was was located in Southeast Anatolia. And we see written in Syriac, Aprimos, Priam, and Hekabe on the couch, and Ramas standing in the background. Priam and Hekabe we understand, even though we never quite find them sitting on the couch in the Iliad. But what is Ramas doing there? Well, apparently he paid for the mosaic and he put himself in the picture. And to a certain extent, I'm going to be doing the same thing. I'm going to push Hekabe and Priam on the couch and seat myself in the middle. I'll be going back and forth between the Iliad and the recent events, the recent sad and unfortunate events. And I hope you'll bear with me. Book 24 of the Iliad opens with a tossing and turning Achilles, who is unable to sleep, even though he has already killed Hector in revenge for Hector killing his best friend, Patroclus. Achilles feels no great sense of satisfaction or triumph, and he drags Hector's corpse around Patroclus's grave in an attempt to deface the dead Trojan and punish him even further. For 11 days, Achilles attempts to mutilate Hector's corpse, while Apollo and Aphrodite daily undo the damage and preserve the corpse. The gods contemplate having Hermes secretly steal Hector's body away from Achilles, but they do nothing until Apollo turns to his fellow Olympian gods and reprimands them on the 12th day. And for those of you who've heard Yoav in the morning, I would like you to read the speech and see if Apollo's words are precisely the way Yoav portrayed the gods, or perhaps there's a slightly more serious and slightly more civilized element to the gods. Okay, so here we're in text 1 on the handout, and Apollo says to the gods, "You are destructive, cruel, and heartless." By the way, I'm using the new translation by Emily Wilson. The bits of Greek that I put in are from Martin West's. "You are destructive, cruel, and heartless. Don't you remember how Hector burned for you fat thighs of cattle and goats unblemished for the sacrifice? Yet now you have not deigned to rescue him, dead though he is, to let his wife and mother and child and father Priam and his people see him and burn him on his funerary pyre. Instead, you want to help his murderer Achilles, who lacks any sense of justice, whose mind and inmost heart refuses to bend. whose thoughts know only wildness. Achilles has destroyed all pity, he has no shame. Apollo is interested in pity and in Eidos, in shame. Apollo reminds the gods of Hector's great piety and points out how important it is for his family to recover his body and hold a funeral. Unfortunately, we all understand this too well. And only last week, the family announced they were not willing to sit Shiva until their son's body was recovered from Gaza. Apollo, who eventually will participate in the killing of Achilles, contrasts pious Hector with the fierce and pitiless Achilles, who has no sense of justice or shame. Hera then responds to Apollo, but she displays, and here she's like Yoav's gods, she displays no interest in morality, piety, or civilized values. Hera argues that Achilles is the son of a goddess, while Hector is a mere ordinary mortal, and divine descent is what counts. Zeus is the third speaker, and he offers a compromise solution. Hera is correct that the mortal Hector and semi-divine Achilles should not receive equal honor, time. But Apollo is right in insisting that Achilles must release Hector's body. Zeus has Iris summon Thetis, who is to tell Achilles to return Hector's body in exchange for a rich ransom from Priam. These plentiful gifts, says Zeus, will soothe and soften Achilles' heart. And so the gods support the burial of the ordinary pious Hector, but they reward Achilles, the son of a goddess, with great riches. Next, Zeus commands Iris to go to Priam to tell him to collect rich goods for a ransom and then to set out to Achilles' tent to recover his son's body. Priam is to set out alone, and Hermes will guide him to the tent. Priam, adds Zeus, has nothing to fear from Achilles, and this is text 2. And when he has been brought inside the tent, when Priam is brought inside the tent, Achilles will not kill him, nor allow anyone else to come inside. You see, he is not mindless, heedless, or ungodly. He will be kind and spare a suppliant. Zeus's depiction of Achilles differs quite strongly from that of Apollo. Achilles is neither witless, nor heedless, nor wicked. Which description is more accurate, that of Apollo or that of Zeus? Just how civilized is Achilles? Who deserves our sympathy here? The bereaved Priam or the bereaved Achilles, who, Zeus seems to say, has acted temporarily out of character when defacing Hector's corpse? Zeus also states that Achilles will spare the suppliant, the Hecates, and we shall return to supplication a little later. Before departing, Priam consults with his wife Hecabe on the wisdom of his plan to approach Achilles. Hecabe describes Achilles as treacherous and flesh-eating, and he then adds that she would like to eat his liver herself in revenge. And that's text number 3. She says to Priam, how could you even want to go alone down to the Greek fleet to meet that man Sives, who killed so many of our noble sons? Certainly you must have an iron heart. Peace sets eyes on you and sees you, that treacherous and flesh-devouring man. He will not show you pity or respect. I wish I could latch my teeth into the center of his liver and eat it. Only then would I have vengeance for what he did to my son. I've always found Hecabe's wish repelling and frightening, and I saw her words as stemming from a culture of long ago, a culture with occasional ferocious modes of behavior. For Hecabe, Achilles is savage, omestes, literally an eater of raw flesh, and she would like to eat his liver in return. I never thought that I would encounter in real life a similar attitude of barbarity deserving barbarity in return. But in recent months, I've heard more than one person voice sentiments not that different from those of Hecabe. Priam disregards Hecabe's fears and states that he's willing to die as long as he can hold Hector in his arms and mourn him as long as he likes. And you don't have that text, I think, but he says, if it's my destiny to die, I want that death. Indeed, I hope Achilles kills me as soon as I have held my son in my own arms and have had my fill of mourning. And here I'm reminded of an extraordinarily sad scene early on in the war. A group of grandparents stood close to the border with Gaza and shouted through megaphones that they wanted to be taken as hostages in place of their captive grandchildren. These grandparents, too, were willing to die if only they could rescue their young ones. Before he leaves Troy, Priam prays that he encounter kinship and pity on the part of Achilles, and Zeus grants that prayer. That's in text 4. Almighty Zeus, our Father, Lord of Ida, grant that I find in visiting Achilles kinship and pity. Philon eleeon, he wants Achilles to be. So Priam prayed, and wise Zeus heard his prayer. We shall see that kinship and pity are indeed two feelings engendered in Achilles by Priam when they meet. But reading the text this time, I noticed that it took a prayer and the positive response of Zeus himself to bring about these humane feelings in Achilles. When Hermes, disguised as a Greek warrior, escorts Priam to Achilles' camp, Priam asks Hermes if Achilles has chopped Hector into pieces and fed him to the dogs. Hermes replies to Priam that the gods love Hector and have kept his corpse fresh. And here I'd like you to go back to page 1 and look at the second image, that of a skyphos, a big cup, painted by the Bruegel painter at about 485 BCE. And this cup reflects Priam's fears about what he's likely to find when he meets Achilles. And the scene on the cup does not match the story in Iliad 24, but it shows an alternative way of presenting the encounter. Here, Achilles reclines on a couch and he eats. He holds a strip of meat in one hand and a knife in the other, and other pieces of meat are hanging from the table below the couch. The dead Hector lies under the couch, and it's a little hard to see, but his hands are tied, and blood flows from the wound. Here we see a cruel, inhuman, flesh-eating Achilles, who is nonetheless physically beautiful. Priam, who is followed by servants who carry the ransom, is also a handsome figure. He's upright and dignified, unlike his portrayal in other vases as a balding, stooped, and pleading figure, often with outstretched hands. What are we, the viewers, meant to think of these two enemies? Returning to book 24, we learn that Hermes leaves Priam at the entrance to Achilles' tent. He reveals his identity to God and explains that mortals cannot host gods. He tells Priam to clasp Achilles by his knees and plead with him. Such grasping of the knees is a gesture regularly used by suppliants in the practice of hikesia, supplication, a form of ritual request made of the more powerful by the less powerful, a request that can be refused, but generally is not. Priam goes in, touches Achilles' knees, but adds a gesture of his own. He kisses Achilles' hands, and that's text 5. The old king went onward inside the house. There sat Achilles, a favorite of Zeus, and Priam found him alone without his comrades who sat elsewhere. Great Priam came in unnoticed. He stood near Achilles and touched his knees and kissed his hands, the terrible, murderous hands which killed so many sons. Cheras enas androphonos. This is justifiably a famous expressive gesture which leaves few readers of Homer untouched. And I hope you'll forgive me for just keeping on going. Achilles, next we read, and that's the end of text 5, Achilles was astounded, he was shocked when he saw Priam appearing like a god. Priam then addresses Achilles in an attempt to arouse his empathy and compassion, and that's text 6. God like Achilles, think of your own father, who is as old as I am, standing over the final threshold between age and death. He hears you alive, and so his heart is glad, and every day he hopes to see his own beloved son come home from Troy. Well, I have been the most unlucky man alive. In spacious Troy, I had to find a son of whom not one is left. Please, Achilles, show reverence towards the gods and pity me, remembering your father Peleus. I am more pitiable than him. I have endured what no man yet on earth has done. I press my mouth into the hand of him who killed my son. Priam compares himself to Achilles' father Peleus and asks that Achilles display the proper respect, eidos, towards the gods, as well as compassion towards himself. And here, a hostage in the Hamas tunnels, an older woman whose name I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember, she comes to mind. After this woman was released, she told how, as an Arabic speaker, she was able to work out a modus vivendi with the guards in charge of her and the other older hostages with her. When a new guard came along and treated her roughly, she said to him, "Shame on you. I'm old enough to be your mother, but you treat your mother that way? And her reproach worked and the guard's behavior improved. That's the story she told. And here too, Priam's words work and Achilles' behavior improves. And this is text 7a. This made Achilles yearn to mourn his father. With his hand, he gently took hold of the old man and pushed him back. Then both remembered those whom they had lost. Curled in a ball beside Achilles' feet, Priam sobbed desperately for murderous Hector. Achilles wept at times for his own father and sometimes for Patroclus. The translation has Priam sobbing and Achilles weeping, but the Greek has the verb klein for both of them. And I think the use of the identical word is important, even if Priam cries loudly or vehemently. He cries Hagina. The epithet Priam uses to describe Hector, Hectoros androphonoio, manslaughtering Hector, when there is an equally good metrical equivalent, Hectoros hippodamaio, Hector breaker of horses, is also interesting in view of Priam kissing Achilles' androphonos manslaughtering hands. Both Hector and Achilles are formidable warriors who kill others. In general, one of the things I find most admirable about the Iliad is that while the Trojans are the ultimate victims and losers, and many, many more Trojans are killed than Greeks, Homer nonetheless presents many of the chief Trojans as human and humane characters, no less worthy of our interest and sympathy than the Greeks. Achilles pushes Priam away gently, but he nonetheless creates a distance between himself and the old man. There's still some tension between them. Tension was certainly understandable under the circumstances, and Achilles wishes to end the physical contact between them. Such physical contact is part of the supplication ritual. Priam remains on the floor in a lowly position near Achilles' feet. The pair's joint weeping ends when Achilles decides that he's had his fill of crying, and he lifts Priam to his feet, and that's text 7b. But when godlike Achilles had his fill of tears, he jumped up from his chair and with his hand lifted the old man to his feet in pity for his white hair and white beard, and spoke winged words to him. Poor man, your heart has suffered so much. How could you bear to come alone here to the Greek fleet to face me, who slaughtered so many of your fine and noble sons? Your heart is surely made of iron. Come, sit on a chair and let us hide our grief inside ourselves, despite our bitter sorrow. Achilles does indeed feel pity for Priam, and he then speaks out at length, contrasting the carefree gods with care-ridden mortal. He also describes the famous 2 urns of Zeus, one filled with evils, one with blessings, and notes that some might get a mixture of the two, while others receive just sorrows. Achilles also tells of his old father Peleus, who was once married to the goddess Thetis and blessed with wealth by the gods, but now will not receive his only short-lived son back home. Priam, the suppliant, refuses Achilles over to sit down with him as an equal. He is just too impatient to see his son, and that's text 8. Godlike, O Priam, answered him, favorite of Zeus, do not ask me to sit down yet while Hector lies neglected in your dwelling. Quickly, hurry, release him. Let me see him with my eyes, and take the countless ransom I have brought you. A suppliant must acknowledge that he accepts what is being offered. That's part of the ritual. But Priam has no patience for niceties, and he just wants to see his son. His refusal arouses Achilles' latent anger and violence, and that's text 8b. Swift-footed Lord Achilles scowled at him and said, do not enrage me now, old man. I had myself already planned to give you Hector. Do not stir up my grieving heart too much. Stop now, old man, or else I will not spare you, although you're a suppliant in my tent, and I would violate the laws of Zeus. This seems realistic to me. Violent relationships cannot be erased overnight, and there are grave dangers when negotiating with a cruel enemy. Here we see Apollo's pitiless, violent Achilles, not the hero described by Zeus, for Achilles is ready to be alitemo, to violate Zeus's laws and harm the old king. Priam then obeys his hosts and sits down out of fear, and Achilles hurries outside and arranges for the care of Hector's corpse. Servant women wash, anoint, dress, and wrap up the body in some of the fine cloths that Priam has brought as ransom. Achilles himself then places the wrapped up corpse on Priam's wagon. And that's text number 9. He brought Hector's body to the women privately, so that Priam would not see his son, in case the sight of him might make his grieving heart unable to contain his rage. And then Achilles would himself be roused in heart and kill him and transgress the laws of Zeus. The threat of violence still hangs in the air, and Achilles doesn't trust himself to behave in a restrained manner if he faces Priam over Hector's exposed corpse in angry Priam. And here I want you to again look at the cup on the first page of the handout. And what's interesting in this cup is you can see that Achilles' head is turned away. He's yet to notice Priam. And it's clear too that the upright, dignified Priam has yet to see Hector tied up under the dead Hector, tied up under the table. We're here at the moment before the two of them encounter each other with the dead Hector underneath. And we have to imagine what will happen next. Before returning to his tent and the seated Priam, Achilles justifies himself to the dead Patroclus. There will be a great ransom, Achilles tells his friend, and you will have a fair share of it. And we can see that the rich ransom ordered by Zeus does indeed play a part, and it helps to calm Achilles down. Achilles expects that the receipt of ransom will also have a good effect on Patroclus as well. When he returns to his tent, Achilles helps prepare a meal and Priam eat their fill. Next comes an extraordinarily beautiful moment when they look at one another, and that is text 10. But when their hunger and their thirst was sated, Dardanian Priam marveled at Achilles, his size, his beauty. He looked like the gods. Achilles marveled at Dardanian Priam, his fine appearance and the words he spoke. They gazed at one another in surprise. The two are presented as equals now, sharing identical reflections reflected in the almost identical words used by Homer. When they both have their fill of wonder, this time it is Priam who is the first to speak up, and he asks to go to bed. Achilles arranges for him to sleep outdoors so that he won't be seen by other Greeks who might cause trouble and delay the ransom. Before Priam leaves the tent, they arrange for a ceasefire of 11 days so that the Trojans will have time to mourn Hector properly. And that's text number 11. Swift-footed Lord Achilles answered him, "Old King Priam, this will happen as you request. I will hold back the war as long as you have asked." With this, he took the old man's right hand by his wrist to calm his heart so that he would not be afraid. Achilles is gentle and reassuring, and Priam goes to sleep. But the god Hermes is awake and uneasy. He's concerned that Agamemnon or another Greek will hold Priam for ransom, and he arranges a swift and silent return to Troy for Priam and his cargo. In this fashion, Priam's meeting with Achilles is framed by the presence of a god who's needed to guarantee his safety both when arriving and when departing. And book 24 and the Iliad as a whole end with the mourning at Hector's funeral. Achilles behaves with kinship and pity towards Priam, just as the old king prayed. And their encounter is one of the most moving passages in Homer. There is a shift in Achilles' sensibility, and the pair, the old bereaved king and the young warrior, come to look upon one another in wonder. At the same time, rereading book 24 now, in the wake of our war, has made me notice other less benign aspects in this encounter between enemies. It is true that Achilles is willing to release Hector partly because of the rich ransom, but that seems an understandable human reaction. More troubling is the frequent underlying threat of violence, first and foremost by Achilles, but also by Priam, by Agamemnon, or by some other Greek. And this violence needs to be suppressed or avoided time and again. Most upsetting of all, in the context of our own war, is the clear need for divine intervention. It is the gods who end the impasse between the enemies and arrange the terms of the meeting between Priam and Achilles. And they are necessary throughout to guarantee a successful outcome to the encounter. I'm not sure if the modern equivalents of Apollo, Zeus, Hermes, and Thetis are to be found. And I'm glad that our next talk will be dealing with the healing to be found in Homer.
very much. Debbie, stay here. It's, chilling and comforting at the same time. I mean, because we're reminded of the humanity that can be, and chilling in how similar throughout the distance that Andrea talked about. I'm going to steal a few minutes. I know we're supposed to finish this session at 10:02, but we may be finishing a few minutes later in order to give an opportunity if anyone wants to ask a question now or make a comment. Yeah, okay. I don't, you know how to work this? No. You guys, no. Yeah.
Find the other one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. I was just wondering, thank you very much. I was just wondering about citation number 10. You know, about the mutual wonder. I was wondering, okay, about the wonder.
You were sorry about that?
About the wonder itself,
Yeah,
mutual
yeah.
wonder. And
Mhm.
I found it a bit surprising that because both of them are supposed to look quite horrible, okay, because they're indeed brief, both of them,
You're back.
Okay. because of their.
Yeah, that's
Can I repeat my question? Okay. And, okay, I was wondering regarding the wonder about the beauty and everything, because they're both indeed brief. And actually, both of them are supposed to look horrendous. So how do you, is it just, I mean, it's mutual, it's not just the one person who looks at the other, and I found it, I mean, realistically, I found it surprising, so.
Okay, well, one thing is they just finished a meal together, but I think it's more that, sorry, I have a very, what's the word? Child's reference to, I don't know if any of you are acquainted with David Grossman's book, Itamar Pogesh Hanav, where Itamar is more afraid of anything in the world than this rabbit, and the rabbit is more afraid of anything in the world than the little boy, and then they finally see each other. They actually see each other for what they are. And I think that's what's happening here. It's not so much are they physically beautiful, but they're seeing that they're real. Exactly.
Yes.
Thank you
Gabriel?
so much for this beautiful speech. Very valuable. What did you call me?
Yeah, you raised your hand, right?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. This will be probably the last.
After this reconciliation, they go back to war.
Yeah.
Do you think that was a mature and beautiful touch to add, tragic but bittersweet touch, or do you think that was a mistake?
What, the reconciliation or going to war?
The fact that they know that they have to go back to war after.
I think it's a realistic part of the story that you can't avoid. I mean, you might ask, why does the Iliad end with Hector's funeral rather than with the conquest of Troy, or rather than with Achilles' own death, which is hinted at throughout. And don't forget also that what we hear at the very end are eulogies for Hector. I mean, there's this beautiful reconciliation, and then there's a great deal of mourning about what has been lost. Okay? I'm not sure that answers your question, but I think Homer did a good job.
I think I'll let Ophir make one quick question, then we're gonna have to move on to our next speaker.
While you speak, I talked about the software frequency during World War I. If anyone knows,
Sorry?
during World War I,
Yeah.
and there was on Christmas Eve, stopping fighting.
When they played each other, they played soccer or something.
They
Yeah.
played soccer one against the
Yeah,
other and
yeah.
ran together.
Yeah.
And then tomorrow they kept fighting this horrible war. And it's like it has the exact same human need inside the wall to find humanity in the other side. And so it's connected.
It's also a little bit like the flashback that we have when some battle was said to take place near where once upon a time the Trojan women would go out and do their laundry. So Homer has these touches of a simpler, more peaceful life that took place before the war.
Just to make a short comment, and then we're gonna move on.
I think the Iliad ends here.
because it is not a chronicle of war. It is a reflection of war. And this is the whole point. If he had gone on, say, and then afterwards, Achilles was killed, then it's a chronicle. Here, he's reflecting on the point is that in the absence of seeing each other, they can demonize each other. But
Well, that's
when-
Itamar and the
when-
rabbit,
when
yeah.
it comes, when they suddenly see each other as actual human beings and not as and not as the enemies they constructed one. And that is what makes the ending. It's not a chronicle of war. It's not an exaltation of war, but rather it's a comment on war. And this is ending. It throws into question as we're all fighting wars and seem to try to avoid it, but there's something inhuman about it too.
Thank you very much.
Very much for all the comments and questions. I would like, thank you. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Ariadne Constantino of Baglan University, an alumna of the Classics Department of the Hebrew University, who is doing very exciting work on myth, image, gender, reception, bridging ancient and modern Greek language and culture. She's going to be talking about, she's writing now about Hestia. She's also had a very exciting project on the representation of Jerusalem in modern Greek literature, but she's going to talk to us about healing in the Odyssey and healing with the Odyssey. And I hope we have time for a question or two after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Okay. Can you all hear me properly? Yes? Okay, good. So thank you, Andrea, and thank you everyone for the invitation to take part in this workshop and the opportunity to think out loud with you about what turns out to be not such an easy topic for me. So preparing this presentation felt like an inner journey, like a small odyssey, but I can't say Ithaca is anywhere in sight yet. On the practical side, it took some effort on my side, but I decided not to bring a PowerPoint presentation as I would do in a regular academic talk, not to do a close reading of select passages of the Odyssey as I'm trained to do, and not to bring a bibliography in the end, though obviously there is ample bibliography on what I'm going to talk about. I simply want to share with you some thoughts, some general reflections about my own reading of a classic in a time of crisis. Homer asks the muses to help him begin the narration of the Odyssey from someplace. Ton amoten getea to gaterdios aipekehen. He begins the epic in medias res by taking us, the audience, straight to Ithaca, where we first meet his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, and the dire situation in the palace with the suitors due to his absence. In the first 4 books of the Odyssey, we follow Telemachus as he goes to Pylos and Sparta to find out about his father's whereabouts. It is only in book 5, after a long anticipation, that the poet zooms in on Odysseus, the famous hero of Troy, the cunning warrior who devised the Trojan horse, which enabled the Greeks to win the war, is now no doubt in one of his lowest points. Crying all alone and helpless on the shore of Ogygia, the island of the nymph Calypso, Odysseus longs to go back home to his kingdom, to his wife and his family. He has learned his lesson, so it seems, and has come a long way from the arrogant behavior he had exhibited with the Cyclops after he had left Troy. He now must suffer the terrible curse of Polyphemus, and he knows well about the price Poseidon has made him pay. But there is still lots of healing to be done in Odysseus's journey back home. Like the poet, I too must begin somewhere. And since I doubt the muses guide me in this, I shall begin by sharing how during the last few weeks, I couldn't listen anymore to the news or the morning interviews on the radio as I would once do when driving from Jerusalem to the Bar Ilan University campus and back. Too much crying, too much loss and grief, and I imagine I'm not the only one feeling that this is truly unbearable. Well, you may ask me, how about some music? It didn't work this time. Music could not provide the consolation and healing that I was looking for. Instead, I took up hearing Homer's Odyssey while driving. I chose a podcast made by the theater group in Cyprus with the Odyssey in modern Greek in the translation by the philologist Dimitris Maronitis. Each book is read by a different actor or actress. And so for the last few weeks, I had the privilege, and yes, I think this is a privilege, to be transposed 3 times per week to all sorts of places. I heard about all sorts of monstrous creatures and wondrous tales, from the island of Calypso and the Sirens to Hades, and even to the murderous slaughter of the suitors at Odysseus' palace in Ithaca. Every week, I would come to my class on women and gender in ancient Greece, where we read the classical texts in translation and tell them how much I progressed. 2 weeks ago, one of my students told me that he also began hearing the Odyssey in a podcast. And I hope he enjoys and learns from this process as much as I did. And I dare say, yes, he may even find some consolation. The second half of the Odyssey, the one we seem to read less with as students, moves from a wondrous world of monsters and utopias back to the world of the here and now in Ithaca. Though Odysseus arrives to Ithaca at the beginning of book 13, it takes so much time for him to take off the rags that Athena gives him afterwards, when she makes him look like a beggar. Our cunning and daring hero becomes hesitant and slow in revealing his identity to his loved ones. He's content and eager, just as he is sad and grieving, checking endlessly who is loyal to him, as if he can trust no one, just as Tiresias told him to do. Odysseus executes his bloody revenge, and this way asserts his rule in the palace and in Ithaca. Eumaeus, Telemachus, Euryclea, and Penelope prove loyal to him, while the insolent ones, suitors and slaves alike, must die. It is in this second part of the Odyssey, and not in the wondrous lands of Odysseus's wanderings, that I mostly felt in this rereading his struggle to heal, his hard work to really come back home, even though he's literally already there. We hear a lot about healing around us these days. Healing for the families who lost their loved ones on October 7th and ever since. Healing in body and soul for those fighting or injured. Healing for the society as a whole. I'm not a therapist. I have never been a soldier, so I can only speak from my own perspective as a classicist facing a time of crisis. And I do so with the understanding that we still have a long way ahead of us for any meaningful healing as individuals, as a society, and as a region in a long conflict. As long as the hostages has not returned home, as long as the war still goes on and people die and continue to die, no real healing can be accomplished. Perhaps all that the classical text can do is offer some consolation, which is also something to cherish at these complicated times. In his essay on why read the classics, Italo Calvino offers several perspectives on how to define and identify a classical work of art. Some of you may remember what has become with time a motto, yes? And I quote, "A classic is a book that has never finished saying what it has to say." Calvino also raises 2 further points that I find useful today. One is, and again I quote, "Every rereading of a classic is as much a voyage of discovery as the first reading." And the other one, "A classic is something that tends to relegate the concerns of the moment to the status of background noise. But at the same time, this background noise is something we cannot do without." I will have some more to say about this background noise in a couple of minutes. And also, just as Calvino urges us, I will dare for once, I promise this is only for once, to look at the Odyssey without considering the scholarship about it, to read the classic instead of reading the scholarship about it. And in this case, I didn't even read, yes, I just heard the Odyssey. And this way, I could also experiment with the performative aspect of early Greek poetry. Greek society of the Archaic period is basically an oral society, oral with an O and oral with an AU. So the poetry was not intended to be read or read in silence as we do, but to be performed in public. We often consider in our classes the cinematic effects of Homeric poetry, the power of its figurative language to create a visual image in our mind, how recited words can turn into a movie in our imagination. This was the effect I was looking for when I chose the podcast. So now I will turn to discuss what this rereading has taught me about the Odyssey. Did I grasp something differently this time because of the war? I want to raise 3 points, and to these I will add a fourth as my concluding remark that will take us to the topic of teaching the classics in times of crisis. The first point has to do with crying. We've already heard about it a bit. It is well known that epic heroes cry, and this external expression of their emotions is described as quite a natural reaction in the Iliad and the Odyssey. I mentioned above how Odysseus cries alone at the beach when we first encounter him, and also memorable are the scenes at the island of the Phaeacians, when the singing of the Demodocus causes Odysseus to cry, and so he covers his face with his mantle. But Odysseus does not only cry when he's alone. When he and his comrades are safe from the Cyclops, they take a moment to express in weeping the horror of what they've just witnessed. Of course, Odysseus is very quick to tell them to stop, yes. Even in Hades, Agamemnon and Odysseus both weep once they recognize each other. Still later in Ithaca, Odysseus allows himself to shed a tear from his cheek when he finally hugs his son after telling him who he really is. When later on, still as a beggar, Odysseus talks with Penelope, he will now find the strength to restrain himself and not cry, as she does, so as not to reveal his identity. This weeping helps the hero cope with his strong emotions, and externalization of pain and loss seem to help him heal. In my rereading of the Odyssey, I noticed these moments of weeping and sorrow more than any other time. The weeping is mentioned almost in passing. It's merely a line or two in the text. Yes, they sat there and cried, and that's it. And yet this time, with so much crying and sorrow and grief as background noise, yes, to go back to Calvino's term, my thought stopped at that very short reference, and my own sorrow joined momentarily with that of the weeping hero. I felt at that moment the deep compassion of the poet and his exquisite ability to describe the agony of the human psyche in a way that transcends cultural, chronological, and geographical boundaries. It felt as if art is imitating life perfectly, even beyond words. The other thing I noticed is that while epic heroes cry, alone or together, their crying never brought me to tears, despite the easiness with which my tears may fill my eyes these days. As much as his story might feel close, what some call it eternal or universal, yes, it is also the case that it is probably too far away, or perhaps for me, too familiar to initiate a reaction of crying, even when reading the epic in times of crisis. The second point I would like to raise has to do with digressions in the second half of the Odyssey. I first read the whole Odyssey back in school in Greece when I was in the 7th grade, the year of my bat mitzvah, coming back to reading the classics at that time. One of the things I remember from that reading was the urge to read quickly. I had a practical need to skip the long Homeric similes I quickly learned how to recognize in the text when a long digression is beginning and where it ends. So ring composition was very helpful at that time. My adolescent self probably strove for action. I was eager to go on to what happens next. Since then, my research has taken me time and again to embedded narratives, what we call the Chinese box or the Russian doll structure, a story within a story. In particular, I have found great interest in mythological and in similes, both in epic poetry and in tragedy. What surprised me in this reading of the Odyssey is that my grieving soul managed to find some comfort in the long digressions of the second part of the Odyssey, in the epic similes, and even in the most unnatural speeches. I was no longer in a hurry to find out what happens. Other things drew my attention this time. In this slower reading, I could let my imagination drift away with a comparison in every long simile. I let the poet play with my mind in every long digression. Where are we now? In the palace of Ithaca, where Euryclea is washing Odysseus' feet? Or maybe far away on Mount Parnassus, where Autolycus and his son went out hunting with the young Odysseus? Some of the most captivating digressions in these books are what we call Odysseus's Cretan lies. I admit they never till now drew my academic curiosity, beyond their being a pleasant distraction. In this reading, however, Odysseus' 4 Cretan lies, yes, one to Athena in book 13, to Eumaeus in 14, Antinous 17, and finally to Penelope in book 19, got mixed in my mind with a digression in book 15, in which Eumaeus is telling the story of his own background, whose truth we have no reason to question. Besides this mixing of lies and truth in digressions, yes, and which can also be reflected back to all of Odysseus's stories when he's at the Phaeacians, what now caught my attention is not that the action is suspended for so long, at the most dramatic moment, of course. No, that didn't bother me at all. On the contrary, I even felt as if I wanted, as if I needed to suspend time, as if these digressions came at the right time, they were at the right pace apart from one another, and they created a slow, rhythmical ping pong that once set me down in Ithaca and once threw me back to a different time and place. I suspect that what I'm trying to say is that in these long digressions of the second part of the Odyssey, they are not only a means for Odysseus to rediscover himself by being someone else for a moment, but that this alienation may also be projected to the audience, or at least to me. And though healing might sound a bit bombastic in this context, I can't say I wasn't relieved to take a break for Ithaca for a moment, to put even this background noise behind and let my imagination be transposed somewhere else. A story within a story, in the manner of the Chinese box structure, is twice removed from our sorrowful here and now. The embedded narrative, lie or no lie, does not only delay action by flashback, it does not only entertain or distract the reader, explain or predict, nor is it there merely for us to seek the parallels between the two stories. It is not at all peripheral, not that I ever thought that it is. Yeah? But what I learned from this reading, and as far as I know it has not been proposed so far, is that the embedded narrative may also soothe and comfort the reader at a time of crisis. It turns out that the effect of a story within a story adds one more layer that may take the reader far away from the painful here and now. Embedded narratives in the Odyssey did have the power to help me silence momentarily the painful background noise we have had to live by in the last 5 months. It is there in embedded narratives, in long similes and digressions, that in retrospect, I found a space to heal. So from crying and digressions, I now want to move on to my third point. I'm okay with time, yes, which also takes us to the world of women. This is no surprise for those of you who know where I work. I just have to stop for a minute and take one more look at Penelope's reaction when she meets with her long-gone husband 20 years after he left home. We're in book 23, and we have followed closely how Odysseus's disguise as a beggar helps him discover his identity. He eventually manages to resituate himself in his household and kingdom, not where he left it 20 years ago, but where he has found it now that he's finally back home. Is there anything in the poem about a similar process of healing in Penelope, once her husband is back and his revenge complete? The Odyssey does not seem to dwell too much on presenting us with Penelope's perspective. We would need to go to Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad to get a 20th century literary try on how things seem and feel from her standpoint. All the poet gives us, at best, are a couple of allusions about Penelope's pain. When Penelope finally meets Odysseus, knowing that her husband is the beggar standing in front of her, she stays silent for so long. And again, in Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey this time, as she went downstairs, and then a couple of lines afterwards, she crossed the threshold and sat across from him beside the wall in firelight. He sat beside the pillar and kept his eyes down, waiting to find out whether the woman who once shared his bed would speak to him. She sat in silence, stunned. Sometimes, when she was glancing at his face, it seemed like him, but then his dirty clothes were unfamiliar. The knowledge about Odysseus' return and her excitement are there, and so is her loyalty, but Penelope has suffered too much to be able to react now. Healing takes time, and she needs a bit more time. Once Odysseus finishes the story about their bed, even gets a bit angry. I don't know why he does that, but he does. At last, Penelope lets down all her defenses, and her heart and body suddenly relaxed. But has she healed at all? It's hard to tell, but surely the stories the couple tells each other all night, a night which Athena instructs the goddess of dawn, Eos, to prolong especially for them, must have played a part towards this direction. And again, we have consolation through words, or at least so we must hope. I would like to conclude this talk with a fourth point I mentioned above, which is a point about teaching. A day before Andrea invited me to this workshop, I discussed with my colleague Lisa Morris, the chair of our department at Bar-Ilan University, about my wish to develop for next year a new course on the Odyssey. A reading course of the Odyssey in translation. Yes, for the Jerusalem guys, we do have courses where we read the classics in translation. The Odyssey from the standpoint of war, trauma, and homecoming, including post-traumatic stress disorder. Such courses, especially designed for veterans, have been offered in the past in the US, at the universities of Vermont and Pennsylvania, at Dartmouth College and elsewhere. Some of them were taught by a classicist only. In others, a classicist and a mental health professional were both in class. US veterans who fought in Iraq or Afghanistan would now read the Odyssey and Odysseus' struggles and his wanderings and his long-awaited homecoming would somehow ease their own pain and trauma and help them heal. The clinical psychiatrist Jonathan Shea, whom Andrea mentioned this morning, is primarily known for his work with Vietnam veterans and has written 2 books about veterans and trauma under the prism of Homer. One on the Iliad, yes, Achilles in Vietnam, and the other one based on the Odyssey, and it's called Odysseus in America, Combat Trauma and the Trials of Homecoming. I still don't know all the details about my own course, whether it will be only for soldiers and reservists, yes, Miluimnikim, or whether we will open it to all students, what kind of mental health professional I will work with. The options are, of course, a psychologist, a social worker, or perhaps even a bibliotherapist. But if we do manage to offer this course, as I would very much like to, on one thing I'm certain, and I think we can add it now to the many insightful points of Italo Calvino on what is a classic. So we could also now add a classic is a work of art that can comfort you at times of crisis and heal you in many unexpected ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ariadne. I think we have time for one question, maybe one comment, but also afterwards at the coffee break to continue. But if anyone wants, while we are all still here, yes, please.
Thank you so much, Ariadne. It was as.
It's Giacomo, right?
Yes, Giacomo. It was as moving as profound. I wanted to ask, I don't know anything about this podcast, but you mentioned it's from Cyprus. So I was wondering, was it in Cypriot accent or in Cypriot Greek? How does that distance work for you as somebody from continental Greece on one hand? And on the other hand, how does the triangulation work between the distance of archaic Greece, the situation in Israel, and a Cypriot reading of the Odyssey, like living with a broken island, with a broken identity in a place where even when warfare stops, the war doesn't really stop?
Yes, thank you for this question. Well, I'm bilingual. I was brought up with Hebrew and Greek, so it always feels like home. I never bother to ask myself what I do in which language, except for counting. But I will tell you about this podcast. What I was looking for was the specific translation, which is one of the most recent ones, and I like it. And I was also expecting to hear some Cypriot accent, and I was surprised it was almost not there. Only a couple of actors had a bit of a Cypriot accent if you heard very, very carefully, but they did do it in a way that was absolutely clear for me that it's, let's say, a Greek from Greece. So in that respect, I didn't feel anything special. And because it's only the podcast without any introduction or other accompanying material, there was no way to think about this extra layer that you're mentioning about Cyprus, island, war there. So I'm afraid there was nothing there. Yes.
Okay. We'll take one more from Ido, and I'm also the chair of the next session. Wants me to pronounce that the next session will begin at 12:30. So we have time now for.
It's not really a question, so if someone has.
No, go on. You go on.
It's not really a question.
It's a comment.
I'm not sure it's even a comment.
Well, it has a drawing, it has a very long drawing.
Many of the things that you touch on in your talk, imitation, the endurance of art, the suspension of emotion, the definitions of Calvino. It reminded me a lot of Lessing's Laocoon. And very explicitly differentiates, at least between Greek sculpture and Greek literary compositions. But one of his arguments therein is that really the emotional impact of Greek sculpture is found in the sort of liminality between the two there isn't a complete representations of weeping, for example. The representation is always how can I say?
Before the action.
Yes.
Or after, but not the action. Yes.
And that what suspenses the emotion, and what makes it relevant to us. That's how we still feel it. We can
to see that the play, because for example, somebody who read, the effect of the reading loses its potency after few minutes of observation, but the reality and the suspension is really what makes it so effective.
Well, I think Plato would have to say no more crying, yes? So,
Censorship.
excuse me?
Censorship.
Yes,
I mean,
no,
Homer-
no more, yes, let's get rid of this thing at all. But I think that going back to Homer and leaving Plato aside for a moment, at these times when of crisis, we cannot do without the emotion. We go to this text for the emotion. So I couldn't read anymore, what the effect was that I couldn't read the Odyssey with, let's say, a narratological framework anymore. I went to read the response. I needed the response of me as the audience. And I think this is something we might want to do a bit more, not only in our teaching, but maybe also in our research. Not get rid of narratology, I wouldn't say that, but add a bit more of ourselves in the analysis of the text that we're working with. If we are, I don't know, I'm not always that self-confident to do it, but perhaps this is the way to go forward, especially at the times of crisis.
Thank you very much. I hope we all continue in the coffee break to discuss things. Thank you, Ariane.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final section of our conference. Since we are lagging about in time, so I'll be very brief and concise. Our first speaker is Marco Vespa, who is a postdoc research fellow in classics at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he works within the European project Atlomy and focuses on Aristotle's zoological corpus and its relationship to ancient medical knowledge. He is also a scientific collaborator in the Locus Ludi project on play culture in the ancient world, and a research associate in the Zoomathea network on the transmission of ancient zoological knowledge. His main study interests include the cultural representation of the animal world in Greek and Roman literary works, ancient comic theater, and the second sophistic, with special reference to the work of Aelian. He recently published a monograph on non-human primates in the Greco-Roman culture, Geloion Mimema, Studi sulla rappresentazione culturale della scimmia nei testi greci greco-romani, Turnhout 2021, and co-edited with Véronique Dassen, a book on play culture in classical antiquity, Jouet dans l'Antiquité classique, Définition, Transmission, Réception, Liège 2021. Marco, please.
Can you hear? Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, for the presentation. I will just try to read something in English very, very shortly, and then I promise not to read my paper, so it will be more interactive with reading of text mainly. So I would like to express my appreciation to the organizers of this thoughtful, provoking day of reflection and study, particularly the Israeli Institute for Advanced Studies and Professor Andrea Rothstein for extending the invitation to contribute to today's discussions. Examining the classics during times of crisis, especially from the perspective of a European researcher, as I am, removed in time and space from imminent danger, may seem like a mere exercise in academic style. Thankfully, Europe has largely been spared from wars and has seldom faced terrorism. Typically, within classics department, our interpretative focus revolves around what Umberto Eco terms intentio operis, the reconstruction of text configuration of signs and meanings. This entails searching for objectivity in literary research or cultural analysis, starting from a specific written text. However, today in my presentation, I opted for a different approach, one less customary for me. I've chosen to revisit a series of ancient texts through the lens of my experiences as a reader and as an external observer since the tragic events of October 7. This exploration has been informed by my reading articles and viewing some videos related to somehow to my main topic of research interests, namely non-human animals in classical antiquity. The slaughter of dogs and other pets by Hamas terrorists during the assault on kibbutzim in the areas around the Gaza Strip left on me, a profound impact. Watching the video of Bonita, the dog brutally murdered in front of a camera, inevitably prompts, at least in our thought, deep concern and reflection about the suffering endured by non-human animals. The death of these animals, of these living beings, and the plight of those languishing today in Gaza zoological gardens amid the ongoing conflict, confined by cages, deprived of nourishment, and wounded, underscore the tragic toll of war. My perspective lies today at the intersection of the intentio lectoris, so the ideal reading or correct decoding of a text, and usus textus, subjective and partial use of text for specific purposes or interests, as described again by Umberto Eco in his wonderful Lector in Fabula. Reception theory reminds us that philology without hermeneutics is often futile, and hermeneutics requires always assuming a critical viewpoint as a text interpreter. So today, I intend to adopt an unconventional perspective, endeavoring to give voice to those without human words, the alloga, or those who do not speak in ancient Greek, or the muta, to use a Latin term, those who are silent, literally. These categories to describe non-human animals may seem incompatible with our modern viewpoint, as non-human animals indeed communicate, often loudly and emotionally. In this brief presentation, I aim to explore the extent to which humanity's boundaries, and especially our being humans, hold and stand in the face of trivialization, indifference, or even enjoyment of animal suffering. What follows will be a brief exploration of ancient texts, particularly Latin ones, centered around a dramatic event that occurred in Rome at the Circus or Circus Maximus in 55 BCE, where the audience of the show, of this kind of hunting in mise-en-scène, so it's kind of fictional hunting, venatio, did not consent to deriving pleasure from the death and suffering of a few elephants, and instead advocated for their humane treatment by considering non-human animal as a part of the same human and humane family. So I will really wanted to read with you some of these texts centering around this tragic event in 55 BCE. You have here the location of the, let's say, of this hunting, of this venatio, the Circus Maximus, in two different kind of versions. So one, the reconstruction of it, and the other, it is the actual state. We're talking about especially living beings, but not humans, or not only humans, but in this case, non-human animals and elephants. As you know, elephants started to arrive with a certain amount of, let's say, individuals at the end of the Republic, so in the second half of the first century BCE. And here you have what we call the statio or statio Sabratensium, which was a kind of, let's say, corporation of merchants and people dealing with trading of animals, and is in particular what were called like ferae bestiae, so the wild animals coming mostly from Africa. And here we are in Ostia, and it's an archaeological place, the so-called space of the corporation, it's called like that, which was renovated in the 2nd century CE. Here you can see that one of the signs or the symbols of these merchants was an elephant, an African elephant. And the African elephant will be the protagonist of our text today. I would like to really read with you and to try to understand, let's say, how much the suffering of non-human animals could be a political subject in the Roman period at the end of the Republic, and how let's say, this enjoying or let's say not enjoying of animals in suffer could be used to construct and envision a different idea of humanity, let's say, of people in this text. So I will start by, let's say, saying some words on this event. This event in 55 BCE, it's a very special one, especially because we have at least three main sources talking about the same event. One, it's, let's say, an eyewitness of this event, which is Cicero. We will read the text after. The other one is Pliny the Elder in the Naturalis Historia. And the third is Seneca in his treatise on the shortness of life. We have also a fourth text, which we'll read, but I think that it's already important to know that three texts, which are more or less contemporary what happened, Cicero and then 100 years after Pliny and Seneca, they are talking about the same event in three different ways. I will start by Pliny because he gives like a more descriptive, let's say, account of what happened this day of September. We don't know the precise day of the event, but we know that could be in September, probably the end of September of 55. So let's read together. I try to use English and Latin where I could. In Pompey's second consulship, when the temple of Venus Victrix was dedicated, 20 elephants, some say 17, fought in the circus against Getulians, armed with throwing spears. One elephant put up a fantastic fight, and although its feet were badly wounded, crawled on its knees against the attacking bands. It snatched away their shields and hurled them into the air. The spectators enjoyed the curving trajectory of their descent, as if they were being juggled by a skilled performer and not thrown by a raging beast. There was also an extraordinary incident with the second elephant when it was killed by a single blow. A javelin struck under its eye and penetrated the vital part of its head. But when Pompey's elephants had given up hope of escape, they played on the sympathy of the crowd, entreating them with indescribable gestures. They mourned as if wailing and caused the spectators such distress that, forgetting Pompey and this lavish display, especially devised to honor them, they rose in a body in tears and heaped dire curses on Pompey, the effects of which he soon suffered. So some, let's say, Latin. This text is full of categories, of cultural categories that we don't have time to discuss today. But what I think is very interesting is that according to the description of Pliny, we have at the beginning a show, and the public, the audience of this show, is, let's say, enjoying what's happening. This show, this Venatio, is the first Venatio where elephants were settled against humans. So we can imagine that, let's say, the human audience were not prepared to this kind of event. And what happens is that after the second killing of the elephant, so after the killing of the second elephant, we have a change in the reaction of the public. Why? Because something in the attitude and in the behavior of the animals changes. The animals, the elephants, stop to play the game. They stop to play the battle against the Getulian. But they address their attention to the audience. They look at the audience, and they practice something which is very special. And in the terms of Pliny, it is called habitus, which can mean what we now call gestures, or let's say communicating signs. This habitus, it's called inenarrabilis, which means that it's difficult to be described by Pliny and by his sources. It's something unusual, probably because of the knowledge of elephants that human people and Roman citizens had at that period. And what I wanted to show, it's also the vocabulary chosen by Pliny. The elephants are behaving like humans. They practice a supplicatio, supplicavere. They practice a lamentatio, or lamentatio, which are like very much codified gestures. with supplicatio, you normally have, let's say, at least two very important gestures which are practiced. One is to, let's say, to fall on the knees, and the other is to raise the hand and to show the palm of the hand to the person you are making the supplicatio. And probably these kind of gestures, which were very much encoded in Roman culture and which were, let's say, they were important in the cultural encyclopedia, and let's say Roman citizens had to react in a certain way to this kind of ritualized behavior, of course, by humans. But in this case, it's elephants or non-human animals that behave in this way. The reaction of the public is that Pompey and everything he had organized as a consul is, let's say, forgotten. And what is, let's say, considered as the first thing to do is to react in solidarity and in sympathy with the elephants by cursing the consul against the god and by calling the gods against the consul. So what is this inenarrabilis habitus? So we have to know, I didn't have time to put all this, the information inside, but in the zoological tradition, at least from Aristotle, but also in Pliny, in the Naturalis Historia, you find it. Animals have hands, and their hands are the trunks. So as you can see here, this kind of gesture, so to raise the trunks toward the heaven, could be considered, let's say, a kind of a gesture of supplicatio. They are using their hands analogically to human hands. And this is not only my, let's say, it's not only a lucubration of on my side. This is like just to give you some reference, a parallel reference of the gestures of the supplicatio. You can see here passisque palmis, so to show the palms of the hand, and proiectia terram. This is another text, of course, but the gestures are the same. And now we have the testimony that some centuries after Pliny, but let's say relying on traditions of memory, could explain this inenarrabilis habitus. So what caused the audience of Roman citizens to abandon Pompey and to stay with the elephants by cursing the consul and demanding, let's say, that the elephants should not be killed. This is Cassius Dio in his Roman history, and in book 39 is really describing the last years of the Roman Republic, and especially the stasis, the civil war between Pompey and Caesar. For some of them, contrary to Pompey's wish, were pitied by the people when, after being wounded and ceasing to fight, they walked about with their trunks raised toward heaven, lamenting so bitterly as to give rise to the report that they did not so by mere chance, but were crying out against the oath in which they had trusted when they crossed over from Africa, and were calling upon the gods to avenge them. This is most important, for it is said that they would not set foot upon the ships before they received the pledge under oath from their drivers, rectores in the Latin text by Pliny, that they should suffer no harm. So again, here there is a rumor, in Greek we have the text, it's the logos. The logos, so it's something that is said, it's widespread among the people, we can say. But again, these sayings and these, let's say, reports about elephants, so elephants that would have taken oath with humans in Africa before coming to Rome. And the center, the core of the oath would have been that elephants, let's say, should and would come back safe in their lands in Africa after performing something in Rome, was broken by Pompey. But everything is again, let's say, aroused by a communication, a gesture. And here is explicitly said by Cassius Dio that what, let's say, caused all this, let's say, the behavior of human beings is to have seen the gesture of supplicatio. So, taste proboscidas, the trunks, aneten, they raise, the elephants raise, eston uranon, towards the hem. And another point which is very important, which is given here by the Greek Olophuronto, I can go perhaps. No. Yes. And here you have also in Pliny other terms, complorantes, for example, and in a way also coherentes, if you want. So there is an emotional reaction of the elephants, which is weeping, which is crying. And again, the reciprocity, which was requested by the gesture of supplicatio, is here explicitly stated by Pliny, because the reaction of the public is to behave like the elephants. If you see the Latin, flens universus. So all the public, the audience of the show in the Circus Maximus, started to cry and weep in response to what elephants did. So again, this kind of behavior, so the real encounter of people with non-human animals change completely the result of the show. At the beginning, they seem to enjoy what is happening. They don't understand very well what the elephants are doing. They are playing with the shields. Are they really dying? We don't know. But then when the elephants start communication by applying this cultural scheme and gesture of the supplicatio, and when they start weeping, of course, everything changes. And then some rumors come. So the rumors that elephants had particular relationship with gods and with humans by taking oath before, let's say, leaving Africa. So let's go now to the second testimony, which is the real eyewitness of the events, which is Cicero. Cicero was that day in the Circus Maximus. And he writes a letter to Manlius or Marcus Marius, a friend of him, belonging to the establishment of the Roman Republic. And what he says, it's very interesting because we are seeing that he's trying to convince his friend who could not come to the Venatio, to the spectacles of the circus, that at the end of the day, nothing important happened. At the end of the day, everything that happened was boring, especially for him and for his friends. Beyond these diversions, there are hunts, 2 a day for 5 days. No one denies that they are an imposing sight, but what pleasure can a civilized person, Homo politus, take in watching some weakling torn apart by a powerful beast, or some magnificent animal transfixed by a hunting spear? Even if these events are worth witnessing, you have often watched them, and we who have watched them have seen nothing new. The final day, so the day of the elephants, was devoted to the elephants, eliciting boundless astonishment, but no enjoyment from the common crowd. On the contrary, a feeling of pity was aroused, and a kind of belief that these species, so the elephants, these species of beasts shared some kinship with the human race. So here I put on the text because I think it's very interesting. So there is an opposition. The first reaction of the public is admiratio, so astonishment. But there is no, let's say, enchantment, no wonder, no delectatio, which is a different kind of category in the ancient Roman culture. Delectatio can be approached to what we can call suspension of disbelief. So when you are completely enchanted by what is happening, by the spectacle, by the show, this does not happen in the last day of the Venatio, because the admiratio never was transformed into delectatio. And here you can see the last part of the passage that we read in English, but I think in Latin is even more interesting. Cicero is not sharing the point of view of the public. He's just saying some people and the opinion. So it's a bit like the logos of Cassius Dio. So what was, let's say, widespread among the people, among the turba, among the vulgus, it was that there could be or there should be quandam societatem, a kind of societas or societas. How can we translate societas? It's, let's say, the translator, the English translator translated a kind of kinship with the human race. I don't agree a lot, but I think that more than kinship is, I would say, a legal, let's say, exchange. There is something, an agreement. Societas, it's a technical term of law. And you also have, we don't have time to delve into this, but you also have, for example, in Pliny, a lot of example of societates or societas, societies between animals, non-human animals and human animals, for example, in cooperative hunting or cooperative fishing. So you have, for example, a society of dolphins and a society of human beings cooperating in order to fish some common, let's say, fish. So it's more, it's more an agreement. And this kind of agreement, these societas between the elephants and human beings could be the horcos, could be the oath that Cassius Dio was talking about. So this idea of that something was broken by Pompey. Pompey did not obey to the rules, which were rules, let's say, guaranteed by the gods before that the elephant could leave Africa. But Cicero, of course, it's very explicit. He does not subscribe to this idea because for him, from a Stoic logocentric point of view, elephants have no kind of societas, be it an agreement or be it kinship with human beings. But this was something that was, let's say, widespread among the public, the audience. And let's go to the last text, which is the text of Seneca on the shortness of life, De Brevitate Vitae. Seneca is discussing the importance of using time and what is worth, let's say, considering as worthwhile for a wise man, a philosopher, and let's say in the path towards virtue. And he uses this example in the discussion he does. A leading man of the state, and according to report, distinguished among the foremost citizens of old for the kindness of his heart, he's speaking about Pompey. He thought it a noteworthy kind of spectacle to put men to death by a novel fashion. Are they fighting to the death? It's not sufficient. Are they torn to pieces? It's not sufficient. Let them be crushed by creatures of enormous bulk. It would have been better for such things to be forgotten, so that no man of power in the future should learn them and be jealous of an act so unworthy of a human being, res minime humana. And then he continues by saying that the main fault of Pompey was to consider himself beyond nature and more powerful than nature by displacing animals and living beings from places where they live naturally and bring them in Rome to make them be killed by humans in an unnatural way. So we are talking about humanitas. What is humanitas? There are different kind of answers, but at least for this part of Roman culture, humanitas, it's a way of being aware of a community, of belonging to the same family, let's say. I will finish by reading this passage by Titus Livius, which is a text very important because we are here in the description of the wars against the Samnites, and one of the leader of the Samnites against which the Roman soldiers, let's say, made war in 322 BCE, is telling Roman army that he does not know what to do more to be, let's say, to be considered a defeated man. He cannot do, let's say, anything more to declare the victory of the Romans. So I will finish with that. The goods of the enemy, which we had taken as booty and regarded as our own by the laws of war, we restored to them. The authors of the war, whom we could not surrender living, we surrendered dead. Their possession, that not guilty might remain with us from touching them, we carried to Rome. What more do I owe to you, Romans, or to the treaty, or to the gods, its witnesses? Whom can I proffer as empire betwixt your anger and my punishment? I refuse no nation, no private citizen. But if in dealing with the mighty, the weak are left not humanum ius, yet will I seek protection of the gods, who visit retribution on intolerable pride, and will beseech them that they turn their anger against those who are not content with the restitution of their own possessions, nor the heaping up in addition to others' men. So here you have a clear example of what is this humanum ius. What does it mean to consider someone, let's say, something humanus, or let's say something belonging to the same family? And again, you have the same pattern. So if you are not behaving according to the rules of the God, the rules of the humanitas, of course, I will call for the gods to avenge what you did. It's the same pattern as we saw with the animals, with the elephants. I don't have time to go to the last text, but I think that what is interesting and what is behind at least the text of Cicero and Seneca, but also Pliny, is these polemics between Stoics and academians and Epicureans as well about the habituation to violence. So how much, let's say, can we define ourselves humans if we accept also in daily life, let's say, small, perhaps considered trivial examples of inhumane behavior, like, for example, enjoying the suffering of animals or just not caring about their wealth. And so I will leave you with this text by Plutarch about let's say, the teaching of the Pythagoreans. In this text by Plutarch, in the Solerti Animalius, on the cleverness of animals, you can see in an explicit way how much the synetheia, how much the habituation, how much the habit you have every day is important to construct the boundaries of your humanity and of your humane behavior. And I will stop with that. Thank you very much.
Very much, Martin. We have time for one. I think we can do it.
Yes, the Sophia belongs to the fellowship. Fellowship. Kinship means an actual family home. Fellowship means belonging to the same society.
Okay, and you think that this fellowship could also be considered, let's say, kind of law agreements, in the sense that we are fellows in a society of interest, for example?
Well, and historical, it's false. I mean, in the sense that, and even in the stories, you know, you have of people who have a special relationship with the horse or a dog or something. It's like a kind of fellowship. But
Yeah.
That's really the English word, I would say.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is a very interesting, because if you look at this text, you have two traditions of translation. One is more like towards kinship fellowship, so the idea more abstract or general that certain animals have certain special relationships with humans, so they are like nearer to us. Or the other translation, which I prefer, is that behind this term, societas, at least in this text, there is the idea that there was an agreement, a kind of law agreement, which was guaranteed by the gods, that elephants should not be, let's say, killed, and they should be able to return safe to Africa. This is something very widespread, and it's related to the religious feeling of animals, but it's another something. But fellowship is better than kinship.
And the other one, of course, is the relation of humans to gods, but on the other hand, you have the relation of humans amongst themselves. That is fellowship.
Yeah, so I prefer fellowship than kinship. I don't, kinship, I don't agree with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Just maybe can I ask you a bit about the context in which Pliny reports about this, because in a way it's not a kind of This is not for an historical reason, but.
No, it's
why
a-
does it talk about?
Yeah, it's in book 8, so it's the first section of the what we call the zoological section of the natural history. And this is very interesting because it devotes at least 22 paragraphs, the first 22 paragraphs of the book 8, to elephants. And it's in the context of the description of elephants that he talks about that. Because he says that Pompey was the first one to, let's say, present in a show, in a Venezia in this case, the elephants fighting against human beings. So it's in the context, let's say, of giving everything he could give about elephants. And he start this section talking about these animals, which
Or
are
part of kind of the interaction between humans and
Yeah,
elephants. as an
yeah,
example.
yeah. It's
Thank you very much. You know how to change the way of thinking to
Yeah, that's.
Okay, so I'll present you very shortly, okay? And then okay, so Marcina Carlos is a principal researcher at the University of Lisbon, a docent at the University of Helsinki, and in 2023-24, an individual fellow at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. Her research interests broadly include migration and mobility in the ancient Mediterranean world in late antiquity, Greek-Roman religions, and Christianization of the late Roman Empire. Among the publications are Religious Descent in Late Antiquity, 2020, For Birth and Compulsion, The Rhetoric of Tolerance and Intolerance in Late Antiquity, 2009, Debate and Dialogue, Christian and Pagan Cultures, circa 360 and 430 in 2007.
Thank you. I hope you hear me well. So today we have heard presentations about how to read classics in times of crisis. I will not speak about classics in times of crisis, but the crisis of classics. So my presentation is from a different perspective. And what I will discuss here today is partly based on the classics and its circumstances in my home country, Finland, and Finnish academic life, but also international issues as well. But let's call this the northern perspective. And I start with one experience of the need to justify classics in Finland. I understand classics here very widely. It includes the history of Mediterranean region, languages, material, culture, study of religion, and so on. So some years ago, we were preparing a joint application for the state-funded Research Council of Finland for a big project with colleagues from classics, history, and biblical studies. With big application, one gets advisory support from university research services. And so the grant coaches from the University of Helsinki and University of Tampere commented our plan, research plan for the application. The University of Tampere grant coach, whose own background was in the modern social sciences, asked the intriguing question: why would any research group based in Finland make research on the history of the Mediterranean region? Why would this have anything to do with the Finnish society? And my first reaction was annoyance and frustration.
how can anyone be so ignorant? Does not one know all the tradition, the classical tradition in Finland, and the long scholarly tradition, research on epigraphy, papyrology, just to mention a few fields of the study. But then my second reaction after this frustration and annoyance was to think over the question again. Yes, really, why would one based in Finland make research on Mediterranean antiquity? Why am I doing this? And here I can add yet one dimension to the issue of crisis, namely the midlife crisis, my midlife crisis. And most important, yes, really, what we need to do all the time is to justify our studies for the taxpayers, at least in Finland. We need to explain why classics and the Mediterranean antiquity is important and will be significant even in Finland. This is a never-ending story. It seems every generation needs to justify why classics is important. We all, classicists, have from time to time encountered the attitude that classics is, or at least has something glorified, have been something glorified. And yes, during the past centuries, as is well known, the Greek and Roman culture, literature, and art in particular were admired as exemplary as something to imitate and to emulate. Hence, even the term classical, with the meanings of the first class or first rank, outstanding, etc. The classical studies were the basis of the European and later North American elites, and for a long time this was taken as a self-evident state of affairs that needed no justification. This state of affairs is long past, but we can see traces of the attitudes of the past glory. I take an example again from Finland, where the classical studies continued diminishing as an academic discipline at the universities. This seems to be the trend in European and North American universities in general. I'm not going into details or to sing the lamentations here, but it's interesting to see how in the appeals of the preservation of classics and classical archaeology at the universities, the Finnish universities, it is often repeatedly pointed out, sometimes openly, sometimes implicitly, how classics is the basis of Western civilization and culture and everything first class, and even that without the classical education, all the culture and civilization in Finland will be ruined, and Finland will no longer be a civilized country. So these appeals seem to take the classical culture self-evidently something admirable and outstanding, and at least in the appeals to the general public. But I think this is not why Greek and Roman culture and history are taught and studied nowadays at the universities. These are not admired or venerated by teachers and students and scholars. We study and teach and research ancient Mediterranean cultures in order to understand the ancient past and therefore our own time and ourselves. And part of this understanding is to ask questions and problematize. Mary Beard, the superstar of classics in Cambridge, has described positively in her article, Do the Classics Have a Future? In New York Review of Books, 2012, how people have lamented the downfall of classical languages from late antiquity onwards. And as we heard from Yitzhak's paper, Gregory of Tours was among those who lamented. The ruin of Greek and Latin has been the subject of complaints for a long time, most prominently among the Renaissance humanists. The nostalgia is part of studying classical culture. Beard writes, I quote, "That sense of imminent loss, the terrifying fragility of our connections with distant antiquity, always in danger of rupture, the fear of the barbarians at the gates, and that we are simply not up to the preservation of what we value," end quote. The study of classical languages and cultures was and is always approaching the collapse. I remember the melancholy when I studied Latin at the University of Helsinki in the late 80s and early 90s. My teachers complained how in the good old times, both Latin and Greek were learned at school, and the curriculum of classical texts was so and so extensive, and how now everything was in demise. I am inclined to think that, despite the melancholy of my teachers, great things happened at that time. So maybe they were the good old times. Then, in my student years, the golden age of classics was not when Latin and Greek were massively taught at schools, but when classics in Finland opened to other fields of research, especially to archaeology and history. There was a massive turn to materiality and widening perspectives from the textual canon of classics, and also geographical widening to the whole Mediterranean world. Of course, much of this was built on the previous generation's achievements in epigraphy and papyrology. I think this is the glory of classics, the possibilities to widen perspectives. During my studies and whole career as a scholar, I have heard comments on how bizarre and eccentric classics is. And in addition to its uselessness, it is beautiful like the orchid flowers. In English-speaking world in particular, classics has other kinds of burdens. The English terms classics raises strong emotions and connotations of class differences, colonialism, and whatnot. All this of which, as a Finn, can have only a faint idea. To return to Mary Beard's article in the New York Review of Books, her article over 10 years ago was connected to the debates on the weakening status of Latin and Greek in schools and universities in UK and US. As Beard writes, for generations, the gatekeeper of rigid class privilege and social exclusivity. Consequently, classical education was also a channel to upward social mobility, even emancipation, and for some, an armament in their struggle against oppression and slavery. Margaret Malamud writes in her article, Classics as a Weapon, about two 19th century African-American scholars and teachers who eventually used their classical education in their anti-slavery work. They both, Alexander Crummell and William J. Allen, were empowered by their knowledge of ancient literature. Crummell spoke and wrote of the usefulness of classical and other education. For instance, he wrote, I quote, "All the works of genius, whether modern or ancient, whether the fruit of English or of Roman, of German, or of Grecian minds, are to be thankfully received by us and skillfully appropriated for the advancement of our children and ourselves in scientific, historical, and classical learning," end quote. Now, this example shows that classics was a tool of empowerment. However, what for some can bring empowerment, for others can represent elitism, class privilege and social exclusivity, colonialism and white supremacy. Quite a load to carry, which, as I mentioned, is sometimes difficult to properly emotionally grasp from Finland. But from the perspective of the British Empire's colonial power and from the perspective of the North American history of slavery, it is understandable that classics also has its share of the resentment. Ancient Greek and Roman cultures have been harnessed to justify this and that, slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and racism on the one hand, democracy, anti-slavery, anti-slavery movement, women emancipation, and rights of sexual minorities on the other hand. I am sure that everyone can find justification for one's views from the over 1,000-year era of Greco-Roman antiquity. When staying in Cambridge as a visiting fellow 2 years ago, I was able to follow the debates on the burdens of classics. Usually, there were demands to clean up and throw away from the curriculum those texts or artifacts that are understood as problematic, or to explain them or to mark them as trigger warnings. Some scholars have even within the field of classics itself have proposed that the whole discipline of classics should be closed down. Daniel Padilla Peralta, professor in Princeton, stated in an interview in New York Times Magazine that it would be better if the whole classics died away. Of course, his interview raised a lot of debate, but I guess it was a provocation as he remains as the professor of classics. Provocation can be an efficient way to raise discussion on the renewal of the field, or it can become inefficient by turning the discussion to irrelevancies. Provocation is nothing new, as in the 19th century, people debated on the uselessness of Greek, for instance, in German discussions, and in many disputes, people wanted to just to renew the field. As Tim Whitmarsh points out, these debates within the field of classics, I quote, are signs of vitality, urgency, and passion, quote. They tell us about great interest and even commitment. I would add a remark about these passions. I think that the veneration of the classical education in the past and the eager resentment or even cancellation in the present are the two sides of the same passion. Both sides of the passion tend to take only those features of classics or antiquity classical tradition that fit into the one-sided picture that one is advocating, as if there could not be multifaceted views of antiquity. And then, yet, there can be multifaceted views of antiquity, and this is the glory of classics. One day, Mediterranean antiquity and its heritages will not rouse such passions as they do now, but they can be approached as one part of the human past, which is not first class or sublime, but just human past. So I have just discussed the prolonged situation of classics. On the one hand, it has been marginalized as an eccentric field. On the other hand, it's under debate and even cancelled. But then there is local history. Greek and Roman cultures are part of the local history in the Mediterranean region, and even in Portugal, Britain, and Germany. In Israel, the impact of Greeks and Romans is also visible. Just a few weeks ago, we fellows at the Institute visited Caesarea, the Roman town built by King Herod the Great. Certainly, Greeks and Romans have also been heavily used in the nation building and all else in Italy, France, Greece, and other countries. But local history does not need to be narrow-minded or chauvinistic. In Finland, Studies obviously are not local history, but the Finns are heirs of the Greco-Roman antiquity and classics as well. The area that is now called Finland was Christianized from both Catholic West and Orthodox East. The Finns are inheritors through a long history of reception through the Middle Ages and early modern period. And here I come back to the justification of classics. We are studying Mediterranean antiquity, classical cultures and languages, not because classical past would be something better than other pasts, no, but because we crave for understanding. Understanding history as a part of us and our present, because it's part of our present and us in good and bad. Some features of influences and traces of ancient history are hidden, as one would expect, for example, from the Finnish present, but there they are. And it is important to grasp the influences. For example, our ways to feel emotions and perceive things. We are heirs of ancient literature and art, and today we have heard papers on these emotions. What we need is the scrupulous and painstaking study and research of the phenomena of the past and their reception history in their historical circumstances. That is the glory of classics. Now, I'm going to say a big word that many, including me, have used to write in ironic quotation marks, and that is truth. The task of the researcher is to seek the truth in its complexity, all its complexity. The task of the researcher is not to try to save the world, whatever that means to each individual. The task of the researcher is to keep intellectual distance to the objects of the research. This applies to the study of history and the study of contemporary world. We may be participant observers like anthropologists with the past and the present, and we feel deeply, we have strong emotions, we are humans, and keeping distance and not getting entangled is sometimes tremendously difficult, but that's the ideal. Thank you.
So I will have one. Regarding the question which opened your talk, I think it's, I mean, leaving animosity aside, I think it's a very relevant question to each culture. I mean, here we don't have a problem about classics because Israel was occupied both by Greeks and by Romans, so obviously it's relevant to our contemporary history, and it's also extremely relevant to whatever Jewish identity means. But I think that everything that is not immediately connected to what we are doing, for example, I don't know, in the Ramaji to Israel or something like that. So the question is raised, and the question of money is important because when you give money to one field, then you don't give it to another. And I think that this is, I mean, I think we should have a very good answer to this. And I don't think that I already have a very good answer. I mean, the fact that we are passionate about what we are doing is obvious, but all the discussion within the field are absolutely irrelevant to the question. And I was wondering if there was a real change in Finland, or is it just nostalgia, which is always nauseating? And it's a kind of, when I was young, everything was obvious and beautiful, and now things is starting, and actually we are the last generation of greatness, or whether there was a real change in Finland regarding the classics, because if it is not relevant now, it was relevant 20 years ago.
Yeah, yes. Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, yes, talking about those the circumstances of classics in Finland, yes, I was really ironical saying that, of course, when I studied, those were the golden days. Yeah, I mean, and then my teachers thought, okay, when they studied, they were the golden days because they studied so wide curriculum, so many texts and whatnot. Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, the real change that I just tried to explain was this widening to this interdisciplinary work and multidisciplinary work, which was really breathtaking. Now it seems that I mean, it's always so easy to lament things that now we don't get so much funding as we did that like 10 years ago or 20 years ago and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's about resources. Yeah, and now when I'm then I'm thinking of the number of students who are studying Latin and Greek at universities. That has diminished, but that's diminished also in other languages. I mean, modern languages. There are not so many students of German language or French or Italian and so on. I mean, English language hasn't any problems. I mean, there are students, obviously. So it's it's a general trend of some things are diminishing. Okay, then there are new fields that are probably flourishing and prospering. So it's there are like waves. But then classics, yeah, it's not really doing so well. I mean, there are not so many teaching posts there, and students are fewer. So that's a fact. Yeah.
You teach it in school?
Yeah, Latin in some schools, but even in some yes, some schools, but not in as many schools as it used to be in those golden days. But I mean, for me, that's not the crucial thing. The crucial thing is to get students to university and to have a really wide spectrum of students, and then wide spectrum of this multidisciplinary thing is, I think, the most important for me. Yeah.
So thank you very much. Yes.
Very briefly, to conclude, what has been a long day, an interesting one. Thanks again to IIAS and the Institute, but thank you to all of you, particularly our students, the students of classics who are here. And just to conclude, we've been talking today about the ways we respond to classical texts in our peculiar circumstances. We heard about the distance that we want to keep as researchers, and the way breaking that distance can help us actually use our classical texts as tool to help ourselves maybe and help others. We heard about reasons to continue doing classics after all. And maybe I would like to remind myself and you that classical literature and classical antiquity, classical literature was actually composed in times of crisis. So maybe there isn't much new under the sun. Perhaps now from here, we have a fresh new perspective. Maybe because of the current situation, we can actually understand classics in a different way, and that could be our contribution to the field. And I would like just to conclude by saying that this may be actually the golden age. I'm looking at our students, and you are the future of humanities and the future of classics. Thank you all. Thank you very much.